Welcome to our webcast titled Building High-Performing Treasury Operations, brought to you by CFO Publishing and by the sponsor of our webcast, FiREapps. I'm Joe Fleischer, and I'll be your moderator. I'd like to take a moment to tell you about our very distinguished guest speakers for our webcast. Joining us today are Brent Callinicos, who is a recently retired CFO with Uber, and you may have heard about him in the news, and Wolfgang Koester, CEO of FiREapps. By way of background, I should note that Wolfgang will share further information about Brent, but just so you know, Wolfgang's background, he is the CEO and co-founder of FiREapps, the sponsor of our webcast. He has more than 30 years of extensive experience in developing and implementing currency risk management programs for Fortune 2000 companies and governments. He's been named one of the 100 most influential people in finance and is a board member of ACI International, the Financial Markets Association, as well. Koester holds a Bachelor of Science degree from Arizona State University and a master's degree in international management from the Garvin School of International Management. And indeed, at this stage, it is now my pleasure to turn the floor over to Wolfgang Koester, CEO of FiREapps. Please give a warm welcome to him and to Brent Callinicos. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that introduction. I want to get quickly into just a little bit of background. I myself spent the beginning of last week with roughly 100 chief financial officers from literally around the world, and as we looked at all these topics at roundtables, it was pretty clear that three emerging topics continued to be of most interest. Number one being that of data in general, number two of that is cybersecurity, and number three, financial risk management, specifically in today's markets, the currencies. That was no surprise to myself, as we have a team that for years have been doing quarterly research on companies reporting on foreign exchange impacting their financial statements and therefore their performance. So as you see on this first slide here, that last quarter's negative impact on North American companies exceeded even that of the Euro crisis in 2012. So pretty alarming numbers coming out with over $28 billion worth of revenues not recognized by corporations, certainly in North America, and this is North America only. We actually also had European negative impacts, and that really came from the fact that this isn't about just the dollar versus the euro anymore, but many more currencies. So as you're thinking about what are the currencies that were impacted last, we actually watched those really closely. Some of these, like the euro, will not surprise you, nor will the yen. Russian ruble maybe a little less, but you do have in these calls literally chief executive officers or chief financial officers such as yourself from public companies actually mentioning these, and these are actually shown accordingly. So what you then end up seeing is that we have a record number of companies, and this is probably one of the areas which I know that I'm sure Brent's going to address as well, is really being asked much more in-depth questions about how foreign exchange, impact their financial statements, but secondly, how they actually flow through. So the analysts are getting very specific about foreign exchange impacts.
I want to pose our first polling question, and that is, how would you, attendees, characterize currency volatility, the effects of currency volatility on your business? And what you can feel free to do is select the radio button that corresponds to your answer and then to click on the Submit button. And from top to bottom, the choices are significant, insignificant, or I don't know. And again, you can select the radio button that corresponds to your answer. And then, so that we can record your response to this question, you can then click on the Submit button. Again, we want to find out from you how you would characterize the effects of currency volatility on your business. And again, the choices from top to bottom: significant, insignificant, I don't know. And again, you can select the radio button that corresponds to your answer and then click on the Submit button. What we will do, so you have enough time to respond, is give you just a few more seconds to respond. And then what we're going to do is we're going to reveal in just 2 more seconds, we're going to reveal how you have responded. And so far what we can see is that and this is interesting, I think this is a great learning experience for attendees because it looks like, let's put it this way, a significant percentage, 45% of respondents do perceive that the effects of currency volatility are significant. It'd be interesting to see if that perspective will change later on. But right now, that's the perspective that we see, and it may be that a number of attendees may not fully know yet how much currency volatility can affect their organizations. So with that in mind, what we will now do is turn the floor back to Wolfgang, who will introduce Brent.
Yeah, so that's an interesting statistic that you showed there. Hopefully we have lots of our customers on who are not negatively impacted by the currency volatility any longer. So, but I'm sure Brent is going to talk a lot about, in general, how these things work. So, Brent, thank you so much for joining us today. We've known each other for years, but you've had an incredible and distinct career. Obviously, as your background as a CPA, spending time over the last two governors with the Washington Council of Economic Advisors, where I'm sure you're adding a lot of value there as well. Your teams have, I believe, 4 times received Alexander Hamilton Awards for overall Treasury excellence at 2 different companies while you were treasurer, and of course most recently as CFO of Uber, spending a lot of time in the press on that one, and formerly at Google and Microsoft, Walt Disney Company, as well as Procter & Gamble. I thank you very much for joining us today and giving us a lot of insight from a practitioner and quite frankly then also from a manager and reporting to chief executives and boards about financial impacts to corporations. So thank you so much for taking the time today, Brent.
Thanks for the intro, Wolfgang. As you can see on the next slide, I thought for purposes today it would actually be useful to actually look at my bio through a slightly different lens, which I think will certainly give a more interesting perspective than just some kind of walk through time. As you can see, and it certainly feel like it dates me if I look back to P&G with the Berlin Wall coming down. That was the days of Reuters was a little bitty green screen, and Bloomberg was a twinkle in Mike Bloomberg's eyes. But as you can see, if you look through that time period, the last 20-something years, I've managed through multiple financial crises, and the reason I mention that is there's multiple reasons. The first one is and I'm as guilty as everyone else. Whether it comes to FX or any other kind of financial market movements, we all tend to have short-term memories. As we all know, Wall Street certainly does, and particularly FX. There's certainly a trap when it comes to FX because what we're used to in FX is that it will typically move in what I'll refer to as a glacial fashion over a 4 to 5 year period. And the reason being obviously because it's reflecting underlying relative macroeconomic trends, differences between 2 countries, imports, exports, etc. That's what's normal. And you can go through periods of time where that is what's normal, and you get lulled into a little bit of false sense of security that you have long periods of time to adjust to gradual movements. And it wasn't exactly gradual, but the period of time, think 95 through 2000. Pre-Euro, of course, or at least it overlapped a little bit, but the dollar strengthened 40%. But it did that over a 5 year period. It gives you a lot more time to be strategic, if you will, as opposed to dealing with something in a triage fashion. But if you look over these long periods of time, you're actually left with the impression that FX crises are actually not that uncommon. They're not this high-impact, low-probability event, and treasurers and CFOs will all have a tendency to think of these things as one-time events, and it could certainly be the first time this type of crisis has occurred in that particular treasurer or that particular CFO's role. And what that maps to, as I said before, is a tactical triage approach. If you actually think of them more like, and it's no coincidence, by the way, that I'm talking about this like you would talk about insurance, more of honestly, a high-impact, higher frequency event. I won't call it high frequency, but higher frequency event, your approach needs to be more strategic because this will happen again. And that's true for all financial crises, but particularly true for FX as well. So again, going way back in time, but if you think about P&G, which was my first job out of grad school actually, the Berlin Wall came down. Now these were in the days pre-Euro, so you had Deutschmark, French franc, etc. But the lessons are the same. So you had high volatility in a short period of time In this case, the U.S. dollar actually got weaker, which was good for U.S. multinationals. This served to form my perspective that you have to think about FX as insurance, i.e. you want the upside when it occurs. And it certainly made me a bigger fan of an option-based hedging strategy versus forwards. And then over the next 25 years, I saw one crisis after another, most of which occurred while I was at Microsoft, but I was there for 14 years. You had the ruble crisis, Brazil, large devaluation, and I'll talk about that when I mention implicit FX risk versus explicit. You obviously had Iraq 1, 9/11, Iraq 2. You had, then when you're moving into Google, you kind of had Euro crisis, which I could refer to as, Greece crisis 1, and obviously now we have a little bit of Greece crisis 2, going on today. So these things have tended to, the frequency between these crises have tended to speed up. So more takeaways. So if you look at it through this lens, it also tells you not just what you need to have Treasury do, but what you need to have Treasury look like. And so, obvious statement that Treasury needs to be staffed with talented quantitative people. That's for sure. But you better equip them with the tools, the systems tools, and the data in a real-time fashion. And I'll talk about that more in depth. And give them the time that they and the flexibility to be strategic. Even if, and probably especially, when there's a market crisis. Examples, are a good way to think about these things. And I've spoken about this, one before back in my Google days. When I first came to Google, the company's DNA was cloud-based software, of course. So when we formed our FX policy and we formed our FX team, we leveraged third-party tools, like FiREapps for sure, but also internal company resources. And the goal was equipping the people with real-time, comprehensive, accurate data, and analyses so they could make smart decisions and kind of eliminate those, and I'll be pejorative, but the useless time-consuming process management. It's not a good use of the IQ of the people's time. It also slows things down, and so that sets you up to manage through a crisis. Even though when we started our FX program in 2007, we didn't know a crisis was clearly right around the corner. The other thing that this helps you do is, if you're a first-time, I wouldn't say hedger, if it's the first time you've started to look at your risk as a company, and part of the reason you may have seen the answers on the polling questions before, I'll speculate to be twofold. One, there's a bunch of people on the phone that are primarily U.S.-based, or two, they sell in U.S. dollars around the world. Guess what? You do have FX risk. Or three, you haven't been able to analyze the data in a way that actually you assume you don't have FX risk. And so one's okay, the 2 and 3 are not. But if you look at these crises, and if you're talking to the CFO, if you're talking to the CEO, the board, depends on how your particular company is set up as to who makes these decisions, you can, once you get your arms around what you have as FX, the FX-denominated revenue, FX-denominated expenses, FX-denominated intercompanies, accounts payable, etc., of course, you should look at them using normal statistical analysis, one standard deviation, Monte Carlos, 2 standard deviations, that type of thing. But what you can also do is go back over the past crises and say, what would have happened during that crisis? And it makes it far less theoretical. People outside of Treasury, obviously, it's more normal for a CFO not to have a Treasury background than it is for a CFO to have a Treasury background. So, and for CEOs and boards, they may have dealt with it, at other companies, but they may not have. So it makes it more real if you say, well, during Greece 1 crisis, or the 2007-8 financial crisis, or Southeast Asian currency crisis, here's what would have occurred. Now, supplemented with the more theoretical analysis, of course, because no crisis is exactly the same, but it enables you to add a more reality aspect, to the analysis. The other thing is, obviously, it's relevant. We're clearly in a time where if you have an FX hedging program, you're probably pretty happy. If you don't, you may be hitting the panic button. And the panic button may just be starting with, let me figure out what my my risk is. And then there's a lot of companies obviously figuring out should they be hedging, or is the worst behind us? And I wouldn't say anybody would know there. So crises are obviously typically about more than just FX. 2007, 2008 was about a housing crisis, equity, fixed income, everything, was Armageddon during those days. But for the same risk management principles hold in terms of the type of policies and that type of thing. But for the purposes of today, I'll obviously focus my thoughts around risk management on the currency front. So with that, as a rather sort of long introduction, I'll turn it over to Wolfgang.
Well, I'll follow right up with a question on that one. I'm sure you're waiting for that one. Is as I think about it, and I think about your journey through various corporations, and I remember the times when you at Microsoft were reporting to John, and I'm sure you've had lots of conversations with John about as he was the CFO and then you stepping into that role. I'm really interested, and I'm sure the audience are, there's various people that are in different areas of where they are. They're already hedging, or they're thinking about it. But if you're a CFO, given where we are today, given all this financial crisis, about all these currencies all over the place, moving, low correlations, et cetera, how do you start? How do you start protecting yourselves, and how do you become currency aware? And I think you and I have had lots of conversations where there's a place to have a conversation about whether one becomes currency agnostic. But I'd love to hear, and I'm sure the audience would, about currency awareness.
Okay, sure. And to Wolfgang's question, if you are currency aware, congratulations. If not, and obviously we're in the midst of the crisis, so this quote may ring a little hollow, but I'm a big fan of external quotes, and JFK had a great one which said, "The time to repair the roof is when the sun is shining." So don't wait till you're in a crisis to develop a strategy. Be proactive, not reactive. But be that as it may, at the beginning, next slide. At the beginning, most organizations are going to not be currency aware. They're not really going to have a good idea of what their net FX exposure is because they haven't thought that way. And thus far I've gone through 2 of these journeys. And I've talked to a lot of other companies, sort of one-on-one. So I know a lot of companies, are in this space where you don't forecast in foreign currencies. You don't have your financial tools set up to do things in foreign currencies. And it isn't about gross exposures. Obviously, it's about net exposures. And you can't really have action without data. And so at the beginning, it really is about getting your arms around the data in advance, ideally, of some type of crisis. So what you're going to start with, and I've done this twice now, is a little bit of, unfortunately, a little bit of pain. Because it's an ad hoc analysis. You're digging through systems, and tools and reporting that really wasn't set up for FX, and trying to figure out, and it's a super valuable analysis, of course, but figuring out what is my exposure? What is my exposure now? How is my exposure going to change over time? And if you can figure out operationally how to deal with your exposure, great. I mean, the default should not be hedging. The default should be, is there a way to offset my exposure, the way I source product, the way I do my manufacturing, where I hire, et cetera. If you can make yourself currency agnostic operationally, excellent. Whatever's left as residual risk is what you have to worry about. So you do the analyses, as I said before, use the past crises and your statistical analysis as your base, and then you get down to what your exposure looks like. So this is really just the beginning of a currency-aware organization. Then, depending on who the decision maker is, you're not going to ignore the CFO in that process. You can talk to the CFO, probably ultimately the CEO and the board, depending on how the company is set up. And the conversation you're honestly having is, okay, here's my exposure. Here's my stress-tested exposure, both with what's happened in the past and what could happen in the future, and feel about this. Is this something we want to do something about? And what's key to actually realize is that deciding to do nothing is a decision as well. The default of, well, I don't know what my exposure looks like, and therefore I'm doing nothing about it, and that's somehow conservative, I don't find to be an acceptable answer. I never did as a treasurer, and certainly wouldn't as a CFO. Now, you may decide to do nothing about it, and that's fine. I mean, that's the decision based on the company's DNA, but it's got to be an informed decision. So inform the decision. That's the currency awareness. And if you've decided that you want to do something about it, then then what it does is then you go back upstream and you say, okay, those ad hoc analyses are not going to work. I've got to think about how do I want to hedge this, and you're going to have had that discussion as part of the, are we going to do something about this? And figure out what do I need to change such that I can be more informed on a real-time basis, with the data that I need to hedge, understand the accounting, understand the tax, of course, figure out the systems, figure out the people, that type of thing. But you got to start with, do I want to do something about this? Not say, here's the resources I have and here's what I can do, but what should I do? And then figure out what resources I need in order to support that. So I'll give another example, and this one, another one I've spoken about in the past. So this is basically what we did at Google in 2007. When I joined, there were 5 people in Treasury, and none of them in FX really. And so we didn't have an FX policy, we didn't have FX systems, we didn't have an approach to it. And the company had experienced, if you think of a company that was formed in the late 90s, and you're talking about 2007, the company had really not experienced anything other than tailwinds. Had experienced a weakening dollar. And as it became more and more international, that obviously added, was an added benefit. So I didn't know whether I'd be swimming upstream or not, talking about an FX hedging policy in an environment where, at least recent history, had not shown you anything, that would say this is anything other than gravy. Had the beginnings of a team. A couple of people, they dug in, did a great, deep, painful ad hoc analysis, looked at it and stress tested it with the past, showed statistical analysis for the future, and said, here's how big the exposure is. And we certainly had a perspective. From my perspective, the exposure was too big to ignore, and it was getting bigger. And we had the discussion with the founders, and the board, and we all did, everybody reached the same conclusion. So, pretty much out of that, a foreign exchange risk management program was born. And we did look at as an insurance, and we were essentially assessing risk and deciding what we're going to do about it. And so, what that results in is everyone's now in it together. You have FP&A, you have tax, you have accounting, and so what you now have to step back and do, and IT, and say, how do I make this a non-painful process, more real-time process going forward? And as I said, I alluded to before, our timing was great, as we started hedging right before the financial crisis when the dollar strengthened, very materially. But that's just luck. And, and again, if you think about it as insurance, you'd say, I'm glad I bought fire insurance because, my house is burning. You're not going to say, I'm glad my house is burning because I bought fire insurance. So, that maps to how you should think about success and metrics as well. And reiterating a point, lack of transparency and understanding of risk, that's going to cause you to, that's going to cause lack of action. It should cause lack of action, but that's not an acceptable answer. But what you should take away from the last 2 slides, and my conversation here, is that Treasury can sit in a vacuum. Sometimes Treasury is in a vacuum when it comes to things like portfolio management or things along those lines, a little bit. But with FX, you can't. You've got a lot of stakeholders. Within finance, certainly accounting, FP&A, and tax, you've got to talk to them, figure out what they've got to change about their processes so that you can get more relevant data in a more timely fashion. And I'll give it, sort of a granular example. So even though we had multiple FX programs, one of the ones was dealing with our month-over-month exposures. And the month-over-month would be AR, AP, intercompany, that type of thing. And pre-tools, it would take one person 8 hours to sift through Oracle and figure out what the top 5 net exposures were, and then you would go ahead and and hedge those. So that's obviously not a scalable process, not a good use of that person's time, once a month for those 8 hours, and certainly, in an environment where you have massive movements, a lot of big movements in small currencies can result in a big exposure as well. I also see a tendency for companies to focus on just the bigger currencies, and what you're ignoring there is that in a crisis, you have big movements across the board. You have a sea change in terms of how the market is moving, and just having those top ones is good. It's not enough, though. So for that one, we put technology in place. In this case, FiREapps sat on top of Oracle, and now we had FX at our fingertips. I freed that person up for the 8 hours. They were very grateful for that, of course. I could now leverage their IQ, and we could hedge dozens and dozens of currencies, and do that right around the time our P&L rate was set. So, digging for data, as I've seen in the past, is usually a part that holds Treasury up in a big way. But I don't really think it's an excuse anymore, whether it be FiREapps or whether you're dealing with net revenue or whether you're dealing with portfolio or anything else. There are tools out there now that are obviously way more scalable than people. Systems are scalable, people are not, to say it in a rather mom and apple pie statement. And actually, if you want excellent people in Treasury, because you certainly do, you want people that have high IQ, you want them to be as smart as people on the other side of the phone, which, as an aside, I've always viewed that as my primary recruiting tool, the bankers and the traders and the FX folks from banks. But it may be about lack of technology today, but it shouldn't be, because the tools are out there to actually make this easier.
Thank you very much, Brent. What we're now going to do is we're going to pose second of our polling questions, and actually this has to do with something that's very crucial to senior executives as well as stakeholders within an organization. What we want to find out from attendees, and this will help us transition to another aspect of our discussion, I want to find out from you who are attending our webcast, do you feel that your finance team is equipped to provide senior executives and other stakeholders the data they need to assess your organization's risks? And I would note these need not be restricted to currency, although currency is certainly important. And what you can feel free to do is select the radio button that corresponds to your answer, and then click on the Submit button. From top to bottom, the choices are yes, no, or I don't know. And when you, after you select the radio button that corresponds to your answer, you would then click on the Submit button. This way we can record your response to the question. Do you feel that your finance team is equipped to provide senior executives and other stakeholders the data they need to assess your organization's risks, keeping in mind that these risks can include but are not necessarily limited to currency? And again, from top to bottom, the choices are yes, no, or I don't know. And again, we invite you to select the radio button that corresponds to your answer, and then to click on the Submit button. So what we will do now is give you just 3 more seconds to respond to this question, and then what we will do is reveal how you have responded after those 3 seconds have elapsed. And now what we can see is that a majority is confident. The majority of respondents to this question among attendees have indicated that the finance team is equipped to provide senior executives and other stakeholders the data they need to assess their organization's risks, including but not necessarily limited to the currency. But we have a very significant percentage, around close to 4%, who either don't know or have answered no. And with that in mind, I think this is a great segue into our continuation of our discussion.
Yeah, so as you're thinking about the CFO, and you're thinking about, Brent, from your perspective about informed and collaborative business conversations, I think this is really key, because I think a lot of companies, when they think about foreign exchange, they think they have it on one side, and it's pretty siloed. We've seen that a lot, and we see those areas starting to be broken apart because, quite frankly, tax and many other areas are in those conversations. Can you shed some light on for the audience about that how collaborative this really should be, has to be, and how this information should be shared, et cetera? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that one.
Sure, and I think I touched on that before, but let's dig into it a little bit more. When it comes to FX, the number of stakeholders, as you can see on this slide, and I don't think it even captures all of them, is as long as my arm. As I mentioned before, there's other areas of finance that need to be in the game with you, whether it be accounting, FP&A, and tax. And I saw a tax question came in earlier. Maybe I can answer that somewhere as part of this. Changing, tweaking processes, reporting tools, forecasting methodologies. There's a lot that needs to happen once you move past the currency awareness to actually being able to deal with currency then. So those are the people that are, I guess you would say, in the fight with you in terms of actually making this, making this work. I've lived through pre-FAS 133, and then the transition to FAS 133, living through FAS 133. Accounting is, is something you have to be aware of. It shouldn't drive anything. Tax, is about economics, and tax does drive things depending on where you hedge. The cost of the hedging may or may not be tax deductible. Often companies have offshore entities. I'm trying to answer the tax question here. I'm going to quickly have offshore entities, and that's what the relevant entity that are going to be hedging out of But for tax purposes, that entity doesn't pay U.S. taxes, and the cost of the hedge therefore may not be tax deductible. You better make sure you understand the tax impacts. It's not always that. There's a myriad of tax implications, but that is just one to be aware of. And being aware of what you pay taxes internationally as well, obviously has got to go into your net exposure. So the internal is sort of easy to understand within finance, albeit it's difficult to tackle. You've got the CFO, you've got the CEO, you've got the board. They're obviously key internal customers, as are shareholders now. Interestingly enough, in tech, there's quite an overlap between those last two things, the CEO and the shareholders. But there's also often P&L owners who, depending on how they're accountable, and I've seen it go both ways in my career, they're accountable for a P&L. They may be accountable for the P&L in U.S. dollars. They may be accountable for the P&L in local currency. If it's the latter, they're not really going to care what you do. If it's the former and it's U.S. dollars, they certainly will care. Now, you've got to be careful about having too many cooks in the kitchen, but there's certainly a communication and a collaboration that's got to take place with them. On a not so obvious note, and this is maybe FX 3.0, if you will, there's often going to be companies in your supply chain and companies that purchases of your product that actually are going to come into play in terms of extreme volatility. And I don't know if this was relevant in the first polling question, where people said the impact on my organization is not a very big one from an FX standpoint. You should be careful about, if you happen to be in this scenario, don't get lulled into a false sense of security. For example, you are a multinational, but you sell your product in U.S. dollars. You better understand who's buying it and what they're doing with it. If you're selling to the ultimate end user, my statement's irrelevant. But if you're selling to a reseller, and that reseller is buying from you in U.S. dollars, but then they're selling it locally, let's just say in euro, and they live on 5% margins, and you have a 10% movement, and they can't adjust their price, they now don't have a viable business if they can't adjust their prices. So to the extent that you have bigger margins, you're a bigger company, you have deeper pockets, they're going to look back to you, and they're going to say how you're going to help me, because you need them in order to resell, to the end user. Actually, at Microsoft, we saw this in spades when we sold product in Brazil, in U.S. dollars, but there was a massive devaluation. Now we hadn't seen the devaluation coming, but we had done the analysis and we had actually done some hedging associated with that, and we had benefits we could pass on to the resellers, while we benefited from passage of time before they could raise their prices. So I'll refer to that as implicit FX risk. Now, of course, what's most important is to understand your explicit risk, which is your risk internally. But don't forget that there's a wider world, of your value chain, both before you buy, before you have that product, i.e. your supply chain, and your potential reseller chain, and you do have to understand that. It's not relevant really when you have these slow glacial moves, because it gives people time for purchasing price parity to kick in for them to adjust their prices. But if it happens in a very knee-jerk fashion, you're going to see FX risk is going to come out of the woodwork, and trying to get your arms around all of it is challenging, but obviously important.
Thank you for that, Brent. I think it's pretty relevant, and I think often when I've had initial conversation with corporations too, they really think about foreign exchange being purely a treasury area, but I think you've over your career shown again your thoughts about being a strategic treasurer and thinking about all the areas where people should be currency aware and how you could help them. I think that was a really insightful example at Microsoft, and thinking about resellers and really digging into the whole area about currencies and where is a company implicitly as well as explicitly exposed. So we've heard a lot about people and their, lots of stakeholders there. I've been involved in quite a few discussions, and we've heard this about a lot of discussions in boardrooms and C-suites about currency risk, certainly within the last 2 quarters as well. How do you think companies should be thinking about this?
Well, a lot of those discussions, and I've presented, I've been on both sides of the table when it comes to that. A lot of those discussions, tend to start with accounting, and that's actually the wrong way to think about it. I always hate it when the conversation starts with, here's our impact on EPS, and it makes it seem less real. You're certainly going to turn off, a lot of those senior management stakeholders because, CFOs, CEOs, and boards shouldn't be thinking about accounting. They should be thinking about economics, and so it's the wrong way to talk about it, and it actually can result in a nascent FX program not seeing the light of day just because you're turning that data in the wrong way and actually talking about it in terms of FX. So one of the things I like to say, sorry, back on the last slide, is that sometimes tax doesn't follow logic. Sometimes accounting doesn't. Accounting tends to follow the economics of a deal, though, and it's not true in every case, of course. But if accounting stinks, chances are the economics do as well. So focus on the economics and focus on the cash flow, and the accounting's probably going to follow, in lockstep with that. But it's just a different way of looking at it, a different way of talking about it. And so, at the end of the day, both the value of a company, and the value of what everybody should be focused on is cash. Finance 101, right? The value of a company is discounted value, its future cash flows. And I always think about things in terms of cash. And you may have a lot of cash, you may not have a lot of cash, but if you think about it in terms of cash, you're probably going to do the right economic thing. And so, I'll give an example. And this goes way back, but I do like to learn from the best. And so back in the mid-'90s when we were trying to start our FX program, I went back. It was the godfather of net revenue FX hedging, which was Merck. And we went to visit Merck out on the East Coast. Obviously, I was in Washington at the time. And their FX program, which was really amazing, and I replicated to a large extent at Microsoft, was born out of a crisis, where they had actually not hedged FX or hadn't hedged enough of it, and it actually had impacted their ability to fund drug development, their drug pipeline. And so, that was their own internal crisis, but it resulted in them thinking about FX differently as opposed to EPS. They were thinking about it, in terms of cash. So that is the way to talk about it. Usually it'll map back to the accounting. So again, I don't care if you're Microsoft or Google, using my past employers as examples. If you have large cash balances, or someone has a large amount of leverage on your balance sheet, the same takeaways hold. Analyze what I'll refer to as the life cycle of that FX denominated revenue. You could say that €1 of revenue. Explain to me how it feeds through the cycle. And when it turns back to cash, that's where your exposure is. If you need all that euro-denominated cash to run your business, in Europe, and you're going to invest all of it in your business, great. You really don't have an FX exposure. But if you're going to sit on it in euros, and that euro could be devalued, or you're going to convert it back into U.S. dollars, and therefore you're subject to the short-term moves, then you have a hedge, a risk that you need to do something about it. And then you just have to be economic about it.
Well, thank you very much, Brent. This is a nice segue into our third and final polling question, and this has to do with, we've talked about stakeholders, and one key aspect of working with stakeholders is communication. And so we want to find out from attendees is, have you seen an increase in the number of currency risk-related conversations within your organization since, say, the last quarter of the last calendar quarter, let's say, of last year? And what you can feel free to do is select the radio button that corresponds to your answer, and then click on the submit button. From top to bottom, the choices are yes, no, or I would not know. And that's fine if you would not know, because we want to get your perspective. You're welcome to select the radio button that corresponds to your answer and then click on the submit button so that we can record your response. Again, we want to find out from you, have you seen an increase in the number of currency risk related conversations within your organization since Q4, that being the last calendar quarter of last year, that is. And again, we would invite you to respond by selecting the radio button that correlates with your answer. Again, the choices are yes, no, or I would not know. And after you select the radio button that corresponds to your answer, you can then click on the submit button. This way we can ensure that we record your response. And what we will do is give you about 3 more seconds to respond to this question. And then what we will do is reveal how you have responded. And so just 3 more seconds, and I see that we are seeing some responses now. And what we can see is that a plurality have indicated yes. That said, a rather significant percentage, and actually I would characterize this as a majority, either have answered no or I would not know. I think that is very interesting, and indeed this is a nice segue into continuing discussion having to do with whether analysts have consider foreign exchange to be something to discuss. So we're now going to continue our discussion with Wolfgang and Brent.
I mean, just straight up as a follow-up to this, Brent, how are you thinking about, what are your thoughts on this, analysts don't care about foreign exchange?
Yeah, if people could see me, they would see me smiling because I've heard this, I guess, viewpoint that analysts don't care. And I did see a question coming from somebody that's listening earlier that was on point with this. That analysts don't care about FX. What they care about is the core of my business. And again, I've heard that for the better part of 20 years. And even though there is a grain of truth in that, it's going to be and really does get tested when you go into a crisis. And you can look back through those crises and also see what happened to companies as they made their announcement, public companies, of course, as they made their announcements about, my core business was strong, but here's what FX did to me. And depending on the length of the crisis, that actually gives you an interesting perspective on, do those analysts actually care? So I'm going to phrase it differently and a little bit sarcastically. They don't care until they do, and usually by then, things are not in a great place. And you have to realize that analysts, analysts understand far less about your business, of course, than you do. And so for them, if you think it's hard for you to understand what your FX exposure is, for them it's almost impossible. And so all they have is what you tell them, essentially. And so, as I've always said, the day you're talking, as a CFO, the day you're talking about your hedging program on an analyst call is probably not a good day for you. Doesn't mean Treasury needs to toil in obscurity, but with regards to this, you probably do. So, of course, when a crisis hits, if you look back at these things time and time again, company by company, industry by industry, I don't care. The takeaways are the same. An analyst, some of the analysts will ask, why didn't you hedge? Obviously they will, not surprisingly at least, they're also going to question, why did you spend money, on hedging if you didn't need to, i.e. if, nothing bad has happened. That's a little bit less so. So of course they want the best of both worlds. They don't really want to hear about your FX hedging program. They just want to know that, you have some way of dealing with it, whether it be operationally or whether it be, from a capital market standpoint. So they have no real way of understanding it. And so that actually, has an interesting learning as well. So in the first quarter in which you have a big movement with regard to FX, you may not see as big a movement in a stock price of a company because the impact is only now one quarter. The impact may have been a little muted based on when it happened in the quarter and how accounting P&L rates work, whether they be average or whether they be just one rate per month. And you may have had some type of short-term hedging program in place, but things fall off a cliff, as passage of time goes on. And depending on how the CFO gives guidance for the future with regard to FX, you can actually wipe out a lot of growth for the future, which does mean that you can also get lulled into a false sense of security when you don't see a big movement in your stock price when you've had a big movement in FX, and so you can take away from that, well, analysts don't care. They actually care about my core business. And I would say, of course, there are examples where that actually is true, but don't mistake this for them not caring about the FX impact. So if you have the euro, pops down from 130, to par, let's just say, or even 110, and stays there for another year, your comps in the future are going to be far worse. And so therefore the impact, on a company and the way analysts think about it can actually be drawn out over time. And, the bigger you are, chances, not disparaging big companies, but now you are talking about a battleship. And certainly the less you can afford that 4 or 5, 10% reduction in your foreign exchange related earnings, and if that gets spread out over several quarters, so is the impact from analysts. So the bottom line, if it's going to wipe out a ton of your growth for the next year or longer, my takeaway is analysts absolutely care.
Well, thank you very much, Brent and Wolfgang. You know, we have a number of great questions from attendees, and what we want to do is address a number of these. So one question, this is a question earlier from an attendee, going back to thinking about currency, the currency risks in the context of cash rather than accounting. What metrics or performance indicators, Brent, would you recommend organizations use to make sure that the conversation, the internal conversation with stakeholders about risk, effective management thereof is as collaborative and as effective as possible?
Okay, good question. I mean, I think it starts with, how you measure success, and anybody who's known me for any period of time, or had the fortune or misfortune, I guess depends on the particular perspective of working for me, knows that I'm a fan of measuring everything. Now, capital markets and Treasury certainly map to being able to measure everything, but companies do struggle with what is my benchmark, for FX. How should I think about it? And I would strongly counsel, don't try to figure it out later. Figure out what you're trying to achieve and figure out what your quantitative benchmarks should be. And this isn't necessarily for everyone, but just my own perspective is, since I think of FX as insurance, I think of the appropriate benchmark as being risk-based, i.e. how much am I improving the risk profile of the company, not how much am I spending on FX options. And often I see policies where it's, you're allowed to spend $5 million, you're allowed to spend $1 million on options. It's not the right way to think about it. You don't think about that in terms of when you're buying insurance on your house, for example. You think about what do I want my deductible to be, and what do I want my coverage to be. It's the same way. That's a risk-based approach to the world. That's the same way you should think about it. If a fire breaks out, what do I want as coverage? So figuring out what a risk-based benchmark looks like, with and program by program in FX should have something different. Also allows Treasury to be more nimble, because if you have a $1 million budget for spending on hedging instruments, and then you have a massive movement, everybody's hitting the panic button, you now need to schedule time maybe with your board to have a conversation about extra approval for something, you pulling together a big presentation, i.e. you're not doing what you should be doing, which is adapting to what's happening in the market. So if you have that risk-based approach, it makes Treasury more nimble. It is harder to do, but it is the right way to do it. And since it is insurance and it's not about making money, I think it's always a good model, particularly in this case, to agree on what success looks like up front. Because I think FX hedging, given all the stakeholders, if ever there was a prime candidate for Monday morning quarterbacking, it's foreign exchange hedging. And so making sure everybody is on the same page with what, with regards to what you're trying to achieve and what success looks like and what you're measuring against, up front is absolutely key.
And if I may add to that, Brent, real quick, I would think that you agree with this, because we actually see this a lot, that companies come in, they take a policy, sometimes they even just change a cash management policy to an FX policy, and then they figure out what their exposure and their risk is. My strong advice would be to first, as you're saying, measure your risk, measure what you actually have, and then propose the policies and adjustments accordingly. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, otherwise it's backwards. I mean, using my house example, it would be like, figuring out what insurance I want to have in my house before I bought it. Doesn't really make sense before I even know how big a house I'm going to buy and what I'm going to pay for it. So you got to start with that currency awareness, and then figure out what your risk appetite is, and then that's going to lead to an appropriate policy.
Yeah, I agree.
Thank you very much, Brent and Wolfgang. Well, here's an interesting question. An attendee asks, Brent, how can Treasury advance foreign exchange risk management when the accounting function, and therefore many chief financial officers, tend to focus mostly on translation and potentially run the risk of thinking of foreign exchange risk as merely an accounting anomaly? Brent, how would you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that goes back to the comments that I had on EPS and accounting. If your exposure somehow, and I'd never seen it before actually, so there is some skepticism built into my answer. If somehow your exposure is just accounting, then accounting is correct. That you probably shouldn't be doing something about it, and all it is a translation. If that is correct, then the CFO is doing what a CFO should be doing, which is saying, I don't want to do it because all it is an EPS thing. You know, figuring out, is there a cash impact? Will it decrease the amount of cash that I have to be strategic, that I have to fund businesses, that I have to invest in people, in plants, in products, in acquisitions? Well, again, regardless of whether you have a little cash or a lot of cash, that's the right way to look at it. And then figure, you know, so maybe feeding off a little bit of what Wolfgang said, figure out what your exposure is, you know, from a cash standpoint. We'll tell you what your policy should be from a cash standpoint. Understanding what the accounting impact of it is at the end of everything. Figure out what you should be doing economically and then understand the accounting. Do not start with the accounting and say, the accounting is driving me to do anything. It's just, you know, no CFO wants to hear that as a conversation.
Well, that's very helpful. And actually, Brent and Wolfgang, this feeds into kind of a follow-up question. An attendee asks, are there suggestions or any further suggestions on where to find or how to determine best practices for the manual exposure manual exposure forecasting processes? In other words, is there anything else to keep in mind? You know, following up on Brent, what you have said about, you know, start with the economics, but you know, any other best practices to keep in mind, especially when you're considering forecasting, ensuring forecasting accuracy in the context of currency volatility?
Yeah, I guess as direct to me, I guess I'd have a three-parted answer to that question. We have a passion for actually educating and continuously educating the market and the industry, and as such, always, you know, I would encourage people to go to AR website, and B, to watch the blogs. I think that, and so as a two, just general, how do you actually think about applicable practices for yourselves? We really try very hard to you know, continue to educate the market. I think the other area that I would think about when you're looking to improve your foreign exchange exposure definition in your forecast, actually you need to ground yourself in two data sets. You need to ground yourself in the data set of your forecast, and you need to be able to compare that to your actuals. And what we see a lot of companies now doing, and they hadn't been doing this probably a year ago, was a lot less companies, but a lot more companies now are going in, taking the forecast and not just adjusting it on a periodic, i.e. monthly basis as it's getting reported in from the subsidiaries, but now the chief financial officer quite often is actually tired of hearing foreign exchange as the excuse for lack of performance, and actually CFO is going in and saying, I want to actually know what happened. So what happened in my Swedish subsidiary? Why were the revenues so much lower? I didn't realize we had Russian rubles. And the forecast will flush that out real quick. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, and I'll just add on one thing to that. As you heard me say in my Merck example, and I think folks like Wolfgang and FiREapps are uniquely qualified to actually help companies out with understanding that, since they talk to so many companies. If you have other friendly companies in your industry or even outside of your industry where you know other treasurers that are doing something, go out and talk to them. I don't know how much time I spent benchmarking in everything in Treasury, whether it comes to cash management, how you think about options, portfolio management, and try to learn from, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, as I said. I learned a lot from Merck. And then, of course, over time, I learned how to do things, and I tweaked it, and I put my own perspective and my own stamp on things. And I was always open to, for that exact same reason, folks who were just starting out, that wanted to come in, and understand how you get your arms around that. I think we can all make each other aware. So I would say if you have peers that you can reach out to that have been doing something for a while, chances are they've gone down the same dead ends. You feel like you may be headed down. They can save you time. They've had the same conversations with the CFOs. They've had to think about that shareholder analysis. They may have the same accounting system, whether it be Oracle, SAP, something else, as you. So you can fast track your way of thinking about it, because there's the theoretical way. Bankers will help you, but most bankers haven't worked in corporations, so they don't know the nuances that you have to go through when it comes to getting IT budgets, when it comes to, as the question went between Treasury and accounting, you guys see eye to eye. There's a reason people are accountants, there's a reason people are treasurers, and I've been both. and you have a different way of thinking about the world. And so go leverage your peers, I would say, and albeit it's a little time-consuming, it's super eye-opening.
Well, thank you very much, Brent. I think we have time for just a few more questions. Here's an interesting question. Attendee asks, an organization just beginning to embark on developing a hedging platform and approach to hedging, where would one begin? Perhaps, Brent, I'll start with you, and then Wolfgang, I'd love your perspective as well.
Yeah, I mean, same thing. I mean, there is unfortunately no easy answer to it. It is start with the financial reporting systems, and chances are, if you have an FX exposure, you know about it now. So a crisis has an unfortunate way of, as Wolfgang put it, what do you mean I have a Russian ruble exposure? It surfaces. And so crisis is a terrible thing to waste too. So use it as a way of, both getting your arms around the data and having that conversation. But, obviously you've got to dig into the data. And you may have to make assumptions. Don't go for the perfectionist approach, in terms of I can't get my arms around the last 5% of data, therefore I can't have the conversation. If you get your arms around the bulk of the data, you can then go through that process that I suggested, which is go talk to the decision makers, highlight the risk that that you have, decide whether you want to do something about it, and then know that you're living with that decision. Again, the decision not to do something is a decision as well, but you can't have that decision unless you've got that data. But you don't have to have perfect data in order to get there. You've just got to have good enough data such that you can have a credible conversation on the stress tested impact of that data. And the crisis we're going through, to the extent that you refer to as a crisis on the FX side, is highlighting those things. And so it is probably front and center of a lot of corporations that are at the beginning stages of this. And so you can use that as a way of starting this conversation.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. I think that we have a saying at FiREapps that says, "Let the data tell you the story," and I think that pretty much sums that part up. It's really, before you get into any sort of strategic conversations, make sure you've got cover your bases. And actually, we over the years with hundreds of companies have actually done what we call pilot programs, where in 3 to 6 months we help them actually take through a process. And we had a company not too long ago say to us, "Wow, that was really innovative. We really appreciate it. We saw the data and actually made the decision we don't want to do anything about that." And that's been a great experience, great reference. And at the end of the day, they got what they needed. So they had a pilot, they went through it, and they said, "We've gotten management comfortable with the exposures and don't really want to pursue doing any hedging." So that's one area of it. And we are not really in the business to tell people whether to hedge or not to hedge. We really want to help them get to the data and get to understand what their exposures are. And that's what we've been doing now for 9 years. And certainly, as I think, Brent, with you at Google and other organizations, where we started with the data and let us tell the story, right?
Yeah, and the other thing I'd say is, when you have that presentation to the CFO, your last slide should probably say, again, the analysis and the deck should all be about the economic exposure. So understanding the cash flows is usually a lot easier than understanding the accounting in this case. Last slide should be, and we will figure out, once we've decided we're going to do something about this, we'll figure out the accounting impacts of the hedging. You don't have to know that. Going into it, you've got to figure out what you're going to do, and then understanding the accounting comes thereafter. Again, don't let the tail wag the dog.
One thing that helps a lot of companies, we actually have it on our website as well as a business case calculator, where people really just start to think about what can the impacts be on what the areas, and that helps in the summary as well. I'm
Joe Fleischer, webcast producer with CFO Publishing, and on behalf of our very distinguished guest speakers, Brent Callinicos, recently retired CFO with Uber, and Wolfgang Koester, CEO of FiREapps, we all very much appreciate your joining us for our webcast, brought to you by CFO Publishing and by the sponsor of our webcast, FiREapps.